Okay, let's make a start. You can all hear me okay? Can you hear me? Am I on? This is on, isn't it? No, not on. I might just shout then until we see if we've got... Can you hear me now? Great. Well, what a packed house. This is lovely. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's discussion on Will Hutton's excellent new book, this time, No Mistakes, How to Remake Britain. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute here at King's College London, and it really is a huge pleasure for me to be able to chair this latest event in our Fair Society series that we're doing in partnership with the excellent Fairness Foundation. So I read the book over the last week or so, and I really enjoyed it. Congratulations to Will. It's bristling with lots of ideas, really practical ideas, but not just plucked out of the air. Instead, it's really couched in a deep understanding of our political and economic history that Will brings to it. It also pulls together various strands that Will has been working on for some time now, in his work with the Purposeful Company, his connection to the Fairness Foundation, and in his We Society podcast as president of the Academy of Social Sciences. And it's got a huge amount of attention and interest from lots of people, including the Labour leadership, with Keir Starmer calling it brilliant and making a surprise appearance at another book event that Will was running.
Afraid there's none tonight. There's the Rwanda votes. So it's kind
of... Will gets amplification. He gets a speaker and I don't. So I think, at its heart, it's got one of the key challenges of our time, which we're also really interested in here, which I would say is, how do you find a way to create an alchemy between our individualistic I instincts or tendencies and the benefits that brings, but then also with our belief in a more collective we society? How do you get those things to come together? But I'll let Will say more about that in a second, as we're going to hear an introduction from Will for about 15-20 minutes on the key themes of the book. Then we were due to be joined by the brilliant Kennedy, who's of course leading human rights barrister, broadcaster, and then crucially member of the House of Lords, which is actually quite busy tonight, looking at a really long evening. So I don't think Helena's going to be able to join us. We hold out hope, but it sounds like it's going to be a 2-3 a.m. session in the Lords. So what I'll do is I'll do some questions and reflections with Will for some of the start of the discussion, but that will leave plenty of time for questions and comments from you. So do start thinking of those as you start to hear from Will. So straight over to Will Hutton. Welcome, Will.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. There's a couple of seats here if you want to sit. One's got my name on it. You're very welcome to sit in that one. Bobby, thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you all for turning out to hear me ruminate about this time, No Mistakes. It's a book about capitalism. It's about a book about a capitalism, a society, and a democracy, as everyone in the room. Crisis gets overused, I think, as a term, but I don't think that it's to abuse the word, to say that taken together, that describes where we are. It saps the morale of us individually and collectively, the well-being of us. But it's also a book, and I must stress this, it's almost a book about hope. What I've tried to do is I've tried to kind of fashion from the best of the progressive thinkers in Britain over the last kind of 200 years or more, to kind of try and kind of reimagine what a political philosophy might be that might bring together the we and the I, and a political and economic program that flows from that fusion. And nothing is immutable. This world kind of in which we're living can be changed. So why the title? Why did I call it This Time No Mistakes? Actually, titles of books are really difficult. I didn't hit on this title until kind of the very end. I didn't hit on the title of the state we're in, actually, until the end either. And you're only going to get a line of sight on what the book's about when you finished it, actually, or I do anyway. And kind of there's two targets I have in mind. I mean, for 45 years, ever since the election of Mrs. Thatcher in 1979, Britain's been attempting to put the individual at the center of our economic, social, and moral universe on the assumption that individuals, knowing their preferences and instincts, will self-organize to best outcomes, whether it's companies kind of in the marketplace or individuals in society. Follow your self-interest, and it will paradoxically produce the kind of best outcomes. And the state is essentially coercive, leading straight to the philosophy of libertarian Liz Truss, who I am anxious to outsell in the next. So if you want to make a small political statement tonight, do buy the book. That doesn't work. Capitalism, if left to itself, to self-organize, it generates booms and busts. We've lived through them. Monopoly, it's there for all to see. Grievous and growing inequality, outlined by my colleagues at the Fairness Foundation, and sometimes rank exploitation. But at the same time, capitalism is restlessly experimenting, innovating, driving forward, and importantly, giving individuals the chance for self-betterment, starting a company, advancing a career, whatever it may be. So, my contention is to serve the common good, capitalism, kind of, to get the best out of it, needs guide rails, proactive management and superintendence, and constant insistence that it hardwires, and this is really important, social obligation into its DNA. My view is that the roots of what the crisis through which we're living lies in Mrs. Thatcher and her imitators trying to bring the laissez-faire free market fundamentalism which characterized Britain in the first half of the 19th century, and which even one of its alleged progenitors, Adam Smith, was pretty uncertain about. It's interesting, just to dogleg for a second, it was news to me that in the 1790s, of course, as we kind of faced up to Napoleon, the kind of aristocratic kind of British establishment were very keen that no one should read The Rights of Man by Tom Paine, but they were no less enthusiastic about trying to curtail the reading of The Wealth of Nations. These two, Tom Paine and Adam Smith, were seen as revolutionaries. One because he wanted to create a commercial society based on kind of merit and individual opportunity, and the other because he wanted to create a republican kind of democracy. And actually, Smith kind of is not quite the author of kind of laissez-faire that actually folk think he is. We might examine that in the question and answer session. But that free market fundamentalism was leading to a dead end in the latter part of the 19th century. Keynes tried to make it dead literally 100 years ago in a lecture kind of in November 1924, the end of laissez-faire. It caused slump. It took war and slump to finally rescue us from laissez-faire with the arrival of the 1945 government. It didn't work in the 100 years up to 1939, and it hasn't worked in the attempt to revive it in the last 45 years. And we have a capitalism that systematically underinvests, I reckon about £100 billion a year. We have a society in real trouble. It's no accident that we have the shortest 5-year-olds in Europe, for example. I think the selling of nearly 4.5 million council houses since 1980 has been a kind of the cause of kind of a chronic homelessness crisis. I mean, we've all got our own kind of features of contemporary society which angers us. Those are two which get to me. And we have a chronically underperforming public services. And I lay 4 great disasters at the feet of this attempt to revive kind of laissez-faire economics. One, monetarism and the deindustrialization of the 1980s, which led to a halving in manufacturing employment in 10 years, and public investment going from 3% of GDP to 0% of GDP in that decade. And almost all the communities that were scarred by that were 30 years later to vote for Brexit. Second fiasco was the financial deregulation that began with the Big Bang of 1986 and which led inexorably to the great financial crash of 2007-8, which was most acute actually in the UK, even though its origins lay in the subprime property market or the subprime mortgage market in the United States. Three, austerity, in which actually George Osborne took a leaf out of Sir Geoffrey Howe's book, who was Chancellor in 1980, launching monetarism, by actually launching austerity. Again, the burden of adjustment to narrow budget deficit unnecessary, taken by chronic, acute public expenditure cuts, which were, in my view, unnecessary and should have been a much more balanced approach. Brexit itself, we were going to be the swashbuckling free market entrepreneurs. Global Britain shed the shackles of the corpse of the European Union. You all know the story. And then bookended by the disastrous libertarian Liz Truss and her 49 days, and this kind of libertarian kind of dash for £45 billion of unfunded tax cuts. All of that has its roots in this philosophy. And as an economy and as a society, we are reeling from it. What to do? Well, I mean, in brief outline, we need a step change in public investment. We need to crowd in business investment of that. Don't think that lifting public investment crowds out private investment. It certainly doesn't. We've got to reshape our financial institutions so they support our fledgling companies and help them grow. I'll say a little bit more about that. We need to reorient our capitalism so it's purpose-led and recognizes obligations to the society which it's part. What I'm going to call the ladder, you'll get to that in a minute. And society has to be healed. Productivity growth has been stagnant for 15 years. The proximate cause of that has been this calamitous fall away investment. To coordinate that, we need a different, remodeled and agile state. Why has this disaster happened? In my view, is not only because the conservative right were to turbocharge bad ideas with what was going on in the United States, the rise of the kind of very aggressive political right, which kind of I think is interestingly, may have reached its crescendo in the kind of a bipartisan vote on kind of Saturday night to support Ukraine. It was a moment where actually kind of some of these guys were actually on the back foot for the first time in 20 years. But I think the core of it is that the liberal left, which I lean into, I acknowledge that, but also centrist Tories and One Nation Tories have not made the pro-social case. Too easily kind of lent into or not challenged kind of hyper-individualism. The kind of famous remark by Mrs. Thatcher, there's no such thing as society, and there's only individuals looking after their self-betterment. And what I try to do in the book is to kind of mine a bunch of folk who aren't actually kind of socialists, but who make the pro-social case in ways which I think is absolutely irrefutable. I start with Aristotle. He says, society is not something that precedes the individual. Anyone who cannot lead the common life or is so self-sufficient that they do not want to partake of society is either a beast or a god. I'd like to say that to Mrs. Thatcher and her adherents, and in particular to Liz Truss. God or beast, Liz. Then there's Hannah Arendt, who wrote The Human Condition, who kind of building on this Aristotelian point, makes the point that actually as individuals, you can only enjoy what's individual to you, your private garden, by having the counterpoint of something public. The public park is an expression of nature in its totality. It has its pleasures, and it's important to you, but you equally need your private garden. The two interplay, the public and the private, the individual and society. I'm not sure how many people here actually have ever taken communion or take it regularly, but there is a kind of, within Western society, there is the Christian tradition. When you will go out to communion, you say, though we are many, we are one body because we all share in one bread. Again, a notion of fellowship, which William Morris, a great Christian socialist, builds on. He says, fellowship is life. Lack of fellowship is death. And when Attlee was asked in 1954 what he understood by socialism, he said, we believe in the kind of society where we've fellowship for all. You can't get that in a totalitarian society or where there are grave inequalities of wealth. That is the hope of the world. Because as William Morris has said, fellowship is life. He invoked William Morris in that quote. And then that famous kind of archetypal socialist, the father of British empiricism, Francis Bacon, writing in 1625, makes the point about the distribution of wealth. Wealth is like muck, he writes. It's not good, but if it be spread. Quite right. But who is to do the spreading if not public agency? And my contention is that the good economy and society blends this absolutely kind of core human instinct for fellowship beside the recognition of individual agency. And that's an agency tempered by acknowledgement we have a responsibility to the whole. And I've been very influenced by Richard Tawney, who I am ashamed to say that I had not read properly until I wrote this book, an ethical socialist who would buy into that proposition, but also a man called Thomas Green, who wrote a series of lectures in the 1870s, published in the early 1880s, at the time of just before the Third Reform Act was passed, argued that taking on the classic liberals and the authors of laissez-faire, big thing to do in the 1870s, 1880s. He argued that as individuals, we have an obligation to make society as strong as it can be, because the stronger that society is, the stronger we as individuals will be. Call that the politics of obligation. That he was the father of progressive new liberalism, which so influenced the Asquith and Lord George and the 1906-14 government. It influenced the Fabians, the first professor of sociology at LSE, Leonard Hobhouse, was a disciple of Hill, and of course Keynes and Beveridge were disciples of Green as well. This progressive liberal tradition overlaps with, like a Venn diagram, kind of ethical socialism and notions of fellowship invoked by Attlee. And what I try to argue in the book is that the good economy is about fusing ethical socialism, rooted in notions of fellowship, having each other's back, mutuality, recognizing that we have obligation to society, with progressive liberalism, which rooted in Green's insights, makes the same points, but also is anxious to acknowledge that as individuals we have agency, we have ambition, we want the best for ourselves. And I try to think of that as, in a sense, the ethical socialists construct the kind of ethic and philosophy that creates a social floor below which no one should fall, and from which we can all spring upward. And the progressive liberals say, yeah, we acknowledge that. We are about creating ladders of opportunity upward, but in a capitalism which has a stakeholder and purposeful orientation, recognizing it as obligations to the society of which it's part. Like individuals, you need a strong society, and a society makes you stronger. A strong society is the foundation upon which you build strong capitalism, and vice versa. That's the kind of vision that I try to set out kind of in the book, Floor and Ladder, Fusion of Ethical Socialism and Progressive Liberalism. Now, there's some history to that. I'm running out of time, I think, to do too much of that. Just to say that actually some of the best people kind of in Britain were kind of playing with these ideas in the 1880s and 1890s. There was just down the road in Fleet Street, it's gone now, a tavern called the Rainbow Tavern, where the Rainbow Circle met. Fabians, socialists, social liberals, John Hobson, a great new liberal, edited a journal called the Progressive Review. And the question they were asking was, can we fuse this rising Labour Party and it's kind of wanting to promote the worker interest and it's playing around with ideas of socialism? Can we fuse that with our new liberalism to fuse the two into a single party so that we don't have already the Liberal Party was standing aside for working class trade unionists, a number of constituencies, and there were Lib Lab MPs, and there were people saying, for God's sake, Keir Hardie, don't go off and find this independent Labour Party, it's going to fuck up royally, which of course it did. Every seat was contested in 1895 was lost. The Lib Labbers were the people who held their seats. And Ramsay MacDonald, understanding that was happening, forged a secret pact in 1903, kind of saying we're going to fuse progressive liberalism and ethical socialism. And the Liberals stood aside in 40 seats, and Labour got back in 28 of them. Keir Hardie, so not having any part of it, only got 3 MPs back. So of course, history then takes its different course, 1906, 1914. By the time we get to the First World War, you have a Labour Party that's self-standing, doesn't have any organisation in the country yet. It's supported by trade unions, it's about to become the Labour Party we all know. But its ideology is kind of all over the place. It's basically saying we want to promote the worker interest in a laissez-faire capitalism, was the minimum. And around that banner, everybody from kind of Marxists through Fabians and Methodists could all cohere. We all want to promote the worker interest. Kind of what's happening to the British working class is an outrage and a disgrace and must be remedied. And we'll just make common cause around that. But it didn't answer the question, what is the organizing philosophy? And we've had 124 years of sectarianism and division on the liberal left as a consequence. And I was worrying about what to call this fusion. I came across this kind of statement from quite an interesting statement, actually. By the strength of our common endeavor, we achieve more than we achieve alone, so as to create for each of us the means to realize our true potential, and for all of us as a community, in which power, wealth, and opportunity are in the hands of the many, not the few, where the rights we enjoy reflect the duties we owe, and where we live together and freely in a spirit of solidarity, tolerance, and respect. I thought that's kind of captures close to what I'm on about. And any guesses what that is? That's the revised clause 4 of the Labour Party that Tony Blair wrote. And actually, what was interesting about the revised clause 4 is that it did try to capture what I'm talking about tonight. In power, of course, by the end, too much of it had not been done, although it did leave us 3,500 Sure Start centres, thank you very much, no, only 1,000, with all the fantastic benefit to working class disadvantaged kids under 5. But New Labour did play with this and didn't do it. And one of the things that kind of my emphatic messages to the Labour leadership is this time round, no mistakes. So there's 2 messages in this book. I've got a few minutes left. I think I should probably sit down quite quickly because I want Bobby to have a chance to kind of open up a conversation with me. But what's the program that flows from this? Well, I mean, economically, if we're going to get real wages up and we're going to get productivity up, we've got to lift investment. And for my money, the way you do that is by lifting public investment by at least 1.5% of GDP immediately, and by borrowing, to crowd in private investment. if you're going to get the companies that I want crowded in to flourish, we've got to reshape completely the savings and investment landscape in Britain. I think it is true that taxes, VAT, national insurance, income tax, are very high, close to 70-year highs. But the overall tax burden, one of the reasons why that's the case, is that in the last 45 years, wealth as a share of national income has gone up from 3.5 times national income to 7 times national income. But the contribution of the wealthy to our overall tax receipts has remained static, has not risen proportionately. And one of the reasons for that is that taxes like council tax are still based on 1991 values. If we go into the second half of the 21st century, when I'll be kind of dead and buried and pushing up the roses, I hope, we will be a failed state if we haven't solved that problem. The council tax takes should be, the IFS told me, at least 20 to 25 billion higher. Capital gains tax, same story. Inheritance tax, same story. There is, throw in a few environmental taxes and actually improve the tax kind of collection, and there's 50 billion pounds to be had. That's enough as a platform to support a wave of public investment, because that's going to be a continual addition to the exchequer. And of course, if you were to qualify or reassociate with the European Union, which has cost us a loss of 5% of GDP, which will rise to 10% of GDP as it unravels, that's another kind of between 35 and 40 billion pounds of lost tax. There is tax in abundance without having to raise tax on ordinary folk to support the public investment program that I'm kind of suggesting should take place. Lots to say about what the new institution should be. I'm an institution builder. I believe an institution like the UK Infrastructure Bank or the Business Bank, the BBC, the Competition Authority, the catapults that promote innovation should all kind of be built around this fusion of the we and the I. I ran at Oxford College for 9 years, and fellows of Oxford Colleges who double up as trustees, they're called fellows because they solidaristically uphold the college, but they're also intensely individualistic, as anyone who knows academic life will know. And I witnessed firsthand this ability to kind of live solidaristically, acknowledging the obligations of fellowship, and also to be an individual pursuing your own kind of ambitions, but acknowledging that even as you did so, you had an obligation to the college or university of which you were part. These are not inconsistent values, and they're present in every single one of the people in this room. And the notion that if you lean left, there's no room in your lexicon for individualism or individual agency is nonsensical. Of course, there has to be. And it's the route to a different kind of capitalism. There's lots to be said about what to do about and bind up our fractured society. Having the shortest 5-year-olds in Europe is nothing to boast about. Lots to know about public health, about housing, about education. One of the things that I stumbled on, again, I mean, here I am, north of 70, stumbling on things, but I hadn't realized that the Robbins principle, which applies for admission to university, which applies to kind of over 2/5 of our cohort of 18 and 19-year-olds. So if you want a place at university, there will be one. That does not apply if you want to apply for apprenticeship or training. It's capped. There's one of those disgraceful class divides in our society. We condemn kind of the other half of our population, 18, 19-year-olds, in a kind of mad alphabet soup scramble for kind of a finite number of places. And the scale of the cuts in further education and apprenticeship and training are a national disgrace. Needs to be reversed, but to do that, we've got to get the growth. The agile state requires major change to our constitutional machinery. There's not time to outline all that. I'd like to. But the best antidote to the populist right, which menaces kind of the kind of Trussian view of the world, kind of laced with a bit of Donald Trump, which menaces this attempt by kind of me and others to get this philosophy kind of off the ground. The best way of actually contesting it is to win and to govern well around these principles. It's time for a new British settlement. There was a great reforming government in 1906 to 1914, which actually did play with this fusion. I argue in the book that the Attlee government did too. Never forget, they adopted the maxims of Keynes, a new liberal, and implemented Beveridge, a new liberal, alongside creating the National Health Service, a tribute to ethical socialism. On the same day, July the 5th, 1948, they launched an ethical socialist National Health Service and a progressive liberal national insurance system. Attlee knew very well what he was doing. And when his biographer, Kenneth Morgan, went to see him and his wife when he was in his dotage, he was half asleep, and Vi, his wife, said to Kenneth Morgan and said, well, of course, you have to understand that many of our friends were liberals and conservatives. Clem was never really a rabid socialist. Were you, darling? And he nodded. So I want to put to you that we have the ideas are there to fuse these traditions and around it build a great program of economic, social, and political reform. It is within our hands to be an economic and social and political model that Europe will want to emulate, and we can build a kind of new association of European states around that conception. It's all there to be done. We just have to do it. Thank you.
Brilliant, brilliant stuff. Oh, and I've got a mic now, which is great. That was excellent. Thank you so much, Will.
Took 30 minutes.
Took 30 minutes.
Longer than I wanted to do. Sorry.
Well, no, it's a 380-page book. You distilled it incredibly, incredibly well. It's always really hard to get a book down, but you did it really well, including the kind of the philosophical and historical underpinnings as well as getting onto the practicals. And I think we'll come more onto some of the practical recommendations. But I've probably got I've got 4 themes that would be great to pick up from, based on our work here and including with the Fairness Foundation. So, as I say, greatly enjoyed the book. It's actually got some quite radical interventions in there that do focus on institutions and structures with a really exciting agenda, I think, that builds on the state we're in. The 4 things I wanted to pick up, one was more an observation, but just to see if you've got any reflections on that. So we did some work jointly with the Fairness Foundation for the APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Inclusive Growth with Liam Byrne and John Penrose. And we launched Liam's book here, did an event for Liam's book here recently where we focused on this. So in 2018, the APPG asked people who has the most power in the UK to influence decisions and outcomes for people, and had a list of different types of organisations, including government and very wealthy people, extremely wealthy people. So when they asked it back in 2018, it was actually governments were top. So you had 33% of people saying governments are the most powerful, with 29% of people saying the very rich. We repeated it in 2023, and that had more than reversed. So it's now 39% of the UK public who say the most powerful people in influence decisions is the very rich. And it's down to like 23, 24% for governments. So that might not seem like a massive change, but for me as a public opinion person, when you're looking at these long-term trends, that's a big shift in a short period of time that people are starting to notice that. And that indicates a real change in opinion, and I think provides a license to deal with it, to address that sense. To me, some of that is at the heart of the book, because it's about power. Who has the power to influence those types of decisions? That concern about hyper-individualism and how that is distorting some of our decisions, and then the need to rebalance. I just wondered whether you got reflections on that as a theme, Will.
Well, I mean, of course, I think that there's this man Menzies, who's had to resign from the Conservative Party for making a call at 3:15 a.m. to his agent for donor money to bail him out of being threatened by dark forces, is, I think, the 100th MP in this Parliament to, one way or another, kind of be found guilty of some kind of grave misdemeanor. It's incredible. They're part, and in a sense, what we've got is you've got a, we've disabled, it's the politicians themselves who have, idle hat, that what they, they're in the House of Commons, but they're not doing much because it's so cornered by the executive, and they're just there actually as nodding donkeys to kind of vote through whatever's happening tonight, by the way. I doubt very much whether, although there's going to be parliamentary majorities for this Rwanda bill, I doubt very much whether in their heart of hearts, many Tory MPs going through the lobbies actually believe in it. They're trying to save their skin politically. And what it generates is a kind of, if the politicians themselves are kind of not taking pride in being an MP and all that it implies, because the democracy is so kind of broken down, you can't, you're disabled. The first challenge to private corporate power and private financial power and concentrations of it is kind of disabled at the off. So one part of the book is about trying to kind of refashion our degraded public square and all that means. I mean, our media, our social media, kind of how we deliberate in the House of Commons, how we vote people into the House of Commons, kind of the lack of devolution, kind of, the lack of ethics at the centre of government. It's fundamental, actually, because unless you have that right, you're not able, I don't think, you haven't got legitimacy to have a sustained reshaping of private corporate power. I'm not certain that the people who run these corporations, some of whom I've got to know kind of in my role as co-chair of the personal company, I'm not sure they themselves think that they're that powerful. I mean, I think they're keenly aware that they need to earn a license to operate. And I think that, I mean, I tell the Labour leadership, to the extent they listen to me at all, that to be kind of, a grand bargain with British business and British finance is there for the having. But, you've got to be clear what you want from them. The way that you, for God's sake, recognise trade unions, for God's sake, commit to delivering great social purposes as companies. We want to change the law to do that. We want you on side. There's a bargain to be struck. They can, and one of the things that I always think, and I just finish off on this point, I mean, I'm always struck by one of the great things about, the Labour left can be a pain in the arse, but they have grit, and they give grit to the oyster, and they have, they're brave enough to take on these people, and they put spine. It took Nye Bevan's spine to build the National Health Service, and we'll need some spine to kind of to do the kind of things I think that need to be done to change the financial system. One thing, though, is that even though the stock market's gone through 8,000 today, that actually the city itself has got its back against the wall, and British business got its back against the wall. It knows that there has to be change. So it's got the form of power, but it can be challenged.
Cool.
That's too long an answer, by the way.
That was great. That was great. So my second point is just changing tack slightly. So, and maybe one challenge to the book, just from the work that we've been doing. So I think in some places the book may fall into a trap. I think we all do when we talk about the public, where we talk about them as if they got one view or value, kind of on average, which is about us being social animals by instinct or creatures of a group that value connection, that we have a kind of natural we instinct, and that's constant, or that's the average. But of course, the reality is that there's a really wide variety of starting points among the public on those types of issues, how individualistic or collective they are. Now, one example from our work is we did a review of attitudes for the IFS Angus Deaton review of inequalities, where we were segmenting the public on their attitudes to inequality. And basically you ended up with a third of people that can be broadly described as individualistic in terms of it's down to hard work and effort, and there's not really much structures that hold people back. It's down to you. A third of people who are very structuralist, who see that there are things that help some people forward, things that hold other people back, and that's the real thing going on. And about a third in the middle who think it's a bit of a mix or don't have any views at all on this and are not engaged. And I think from that work, it's also clear that we are pretty mid-Atlantic in our views, our individualistic tendencies. We're not as individualistic or meritocratic focused as the US, but we're also not like continental Europe. We're close, somewhere between Europe and the US in that having that individualistic starting point. And one sort of just like little example of that that I enjoyed as a kind of survey geek in many ways, we ran a sample experiment on that Thatcher, a split sample survey experiment on that Mrs. Thatcher quote on no such thing as society. So if you put to the general public and you just say, do you agree or disagree that there's no such thing as society? 3/4 of people will disagree that that's the case. So we have got a sense that there is such thing. But if you do the whole section from the women's own interview that she did,
quite a bit different, I know.
It is quite different. And the key lines being things like, no government can do anything except through people, and people must look to themselves first, those types of things. It switches from 75 disagreeing to 2/3 agreeing with the quote as a whole, which shows quite how contingent or nuanced people's views on this. And to me, that's kind of at the heart of the challenge to the alchemy, is that we're constantly balancing those deeply held and legitimate views, a spectrum of views across the public. So it'd be great to get your reflections on this. And I think in some ways, just a question that I had when I was reading the book is whether you see that individualistic impulse as being shaped by a misleading media focus, that people have been misled down that line, whether it means that portions of the public need to be convinced and their views changed, or whether you think it's actually a balancing act between those two.
Bloody good questions, Bobby, and I'm not sure I've got a ready answer.
Oh, sorry, Will.
I mean, what do I think about that? Look, lots of things are crowding in on me as you were talking. I've edited the Observer. I was chief of the Observer for 4 years, and I've written a column in the national newspaper for over 30 years, and I've kind of watched the British media become. I mean, the media should form the public square, but it shouldn't be an actor in it. And I was quite struck by the kind of, it's not. It may turn out that this, just our initial reactions to the this chap who kind of this police officer kind of got tricky with the, that kind of the chief executive of the campaign for anti-Semitism, and they made a stupid apology. But the more you find out about it, the more you think, well, hold on a minute. I mean, actually, there was an issue here when you see the whole 17 minutes of the video. He was really going out to kind of, he was really kind of, he was a campaigner looking for the reaction he got, and actually, journalism and newspapers should be kind of more savvy about that. But the Daily Mail puts on its front page, Rowley must resign, and actually, it's an actor in formulating our views rather than trying to kind of accurately report them to us. And that's across that's just one incident, one day. And I do think, in the 30 years I've been in journalism, that I've watched public attitudes change as a result of kind of, what you're describing and what I'm observing. So, that said, I do think, when we get to talk to the audience, you must absolutely, shout out and tell me if I've got this wrong. But I do think that actually, that what I described in Oxford College, you can find it in a local football club, you can find it in a trade union, you can find it in, lots of companies. You can find actually, people holding kind of in their day-to-day interactions, kind of loyalty to the institution and recognition of actually, what they have to do as an individual. And I think that's part of the human condition, isn't it? And I think kind of recognizing that. I mean, I think the trouble with kind of socialism as it kind of developed in the middle of the 20th century was this very kind of monopolistic and top-down. Nationalization didn't really work as effectively as people like me hoped it would. And you had to kind of reconfigure how to pursue the public interest in enterprise. You shouldn't drop the notion. You should actually try to figure it out. And I think a better compass to doing that is the kind of ideas I've tried to outline tonight. So, I've waffled, really.
No.
But I'm trying to stand by my position, even when I concede the strength of yours.
No, I think that balance is absolutely right. I think there is a balance to be struck there. So I've got two more points. So do start thinking of your questions, and I think I should give a shout out to London Review Bookshop at the back, who do have copies for sale tonight. So do get to those before you go, because I think one of the things that's really clear in the book, and we've maybe talked about less, it's got a real focus on practical reform to political institutions and processes that we've got on that. And we did a major conference here, academic conference last week, on the World Values Survey, looking at the UK and trust in our political institutions, and it's pretty dire compared to other. It's declining and low compared to lots of other countries, and we may have got used to that as a trend and a norm, but it isn't normal.
Things are dire. Since 2000, the UK has slipped 21 places in the rank of nations by per capita income. That is the fastest slide of any country, in these league tables since 1945. I mean, it's absolutely, we have our backs against the wall, and actually, the last 14 years has seen this accelerate, and at the same time as you've seen 5 prime ministers, 100 MPs behaving in the manner in which I've just described. I mean, no wonder, stagnating real wages, a cost of living crisis, people kind of finding it hard to live from day to day. I mean, no wonder these things are, no wonder these attitudes are like they are.
Yeah,
Sorry.
No, it's absolutely. And dire things like we're second bottom only to Egypt in trust in our media, confidence in our media, which, if you know about Egyptian media, is not a good place. Not a good place
That's
to be.
That's a great stat. Talk about your art. I must get it in the book.
Yeah.
But in the paperback edition of the book.
But I wanted to get onto a couple of specifics, because about the reforms that you want to do, and really the book is bristling with lots of ideas about actual structural reforms. But a couple of them are actually. One of them is about the voting system, about proportional representation. And I've got two quick thoughts on that. I worked a bit on the AV referendum polling that we had, and it was the most moribund and unexciting campaign and approach that I'd ever seen. Then we ended up with 67% voting against it. You quote the BSA, the British Social Attitudes Trend, which says that we've gone from 27% of people supporting a change in the voting system to 51% now. And I suppose my first question around that is, do you think that we do now have license to engage the public, or do you think we'll just get the same negative, sort of uninterested reaction when we've got all these massive challenges to deal with? Will any incoming government really be able to address voting reform as part of that?
I really hope so. I mean, I started out as a neutral on this. I leaned into PR because I thought, it's a fairer voting system. I could, I was slightly agnostic, but writing the book and actually seeing how it's played out in the last since the last 140 years, actually, since we've moved to the democratic system in 1885. I mean, bloody hell, what a series of disasters that actually consistently and continually we have parliaments that don't reflect opinion in the country. So, for example, in 1929, there was a massive majority in the country for actually what would have been a Rooseveltian New Deal settlement. But, it couldn't manifest itself. There were lots of Labour MPs, but they're all cramped by MacDonald's incredible conservatism. There should have been many, many more of the Keynesian liberals, and within the Labour ranks, there should have been more of them, because they were all there. And yet we ended up, leaving the gold standard imperial preference and the rest falls out. I mean, I could go on. 1951, Labour won more votes than any other it won the 51 general election in terms of votes cast, but had a minority, didn't have a majority in the House of Commons. And we go on and on and on. And I just feel that I want to live in a civilization that has a deliberative democracy in which the arguments in our national parliament reflect public opinion in the country at large. And I want a media which actually kind of honestly kind of tries to tell citizens kind of what the facts of the matter are and keeps opinion separate from facts. It's not too much to ask. And I think that the whole thing is part of a piece, really. What civilization do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a civilization in which essentially the editors of the Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail, Express, and Sun, and to a degree the Times, actually run the country? Is that what you want? That's what you've got. And actually, we've got to break it. And it requires political leadership to look these facts squarely in the eye. Tony Blair kind of leaves office and says the British media is feral in kind of 2007. Well, thank you. That was then. It's got much worse. And the voting system throws up. There should never have been a referendum on the European Union without both sides having to set out clearly in 10 to 12 readable pages kind of what their case was. And there should have been a supermajority for such an awesome constitutional change. But, I mean, it was done on the back of a fact packet because David Cameron wanted to get himself out of a corner. It's no way to run a great country. And actually, kind of every single person in the room, it behoves us to take this kind of, it's fundamentally serious. So the way you're governed and the prism through which you receive the news are of fundamental importance. It's time to rouse ourselves. Sorry, I'll stop.
Great. So actually, that's a kind of segue into my final question, reflection, and questions. So if people can start thinking of questions, we'll start to get the microphones in place. So we got a big strand of our work on culture wars, the growing sense of culture wars in the UK, looking at the UK and internationally. And we've seen huge increases in focus and coverage of those types of issues, whether that's woke or cancel culture. Huge increase in media use of those terms, like ridiculous, going from nothing to 3,600 articles a year that use the term cancel culture. We've even seen anti-woke didn't exist as a term anywhere in the UK media that we could find in 2020, and now there's hundreds of articles that are trying to establish anti-woke. And we're actually even seeing anti-woke starting to establish itself as a personal identity for people, where you've got 15% of the public now see themselves as anti-woke. But it rises to 4 in 10 older men, 60 plus men, 4 in 10 older men seeing themselves as anti-woke. So my reflection on that, I guess, and just to kind of round up with a forward-looking question, is that that focus on division isn't going to go away, and perhaps it gets more risky with a change in government. So there is a scenario where Labour win. They struggle to make a material difference to people's lives because there's a lot of headwinds. It's a difficult context. It takes time. And there'll be some elements who will go even harder on cultural division. So I guess leads me to the thought that the crucial election is in 4 years' time after this one, and where we get to there. But that's kind of probably too far ahead to look. So I guess my final question or thought to you, Will, is about this election and then that election. What does Labour need to do if it does win the election coming up? And then what's your thoughts on the risks for this upcoming period?
Another killer question from Professor Duffy. Look, I mean, two or three thoughts. First of all, on woke. I mean, I wonder whether we've seen peak woke. I know that just in the trans debate, I thought the reaction to the Cass report was really interesting in the sense that people thought it was just common sense, you know, and actually one should be completely tolerant about people's kind of quest to find them to live a life, you know, in the right gender, but actually kind of hold off making, you know, kids below 18 make that choice. And I thought the reception to it was kind of, you know, level-headed. You know, a year, 18 months ago, I think it would have been really kind of tricky. So I just have a hope that we're reaching, and I think the Tory party hoped that actually woke issues would be a kind of culture to, you know, it would be a kind of dividing line, you know, between them and the Labour Party, but actually partly because Starmer and Co closed it down, but partly because there's not much resonance. I do think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, everyone here, but I suppose living in London kind of makes it easier to say this, but I'm very struck going to a football match, or I'm very struck just the, you know, it's a multi-racial society, and we're cool with it. We don't, you know, we're not worried about it, and I'm not sure that I'm not sure that, you know, when Sunak gave his press conference this morning, they're saying, you know, the country watches as we try to get the Rwanda bill through because they're all desperate to get these flights going. I'm not sure how many are desperate. My guess would be maybe less than a fifth of the electorate care. So I mean, my hope is that, you know, it's falling away, and I come back to the point that, you know, governing well. I mean, one of the things that really cut through and changed public opinion was the twin resignations of Johnson and Truss within a few months of each other, and this sense that, you know, the Tory party had created all these problems it was trying to solve. I mean, and it was directionless and had no answers to the questions it itself kind of created, and it cut through, and it's very difficult for it to change that now. So, you know, and I'm not sure that's going to go away that quickly. And it's fashionable to say, you know, Keir Starmer is a kind of dreary chap, and it's minimalist government, nothing. I think he's going to govern rather well, actually. And I think the differences will become manifest quite quickly. And I think the kind of what does it mean to be a conservative in 2024? What does it mean to return to a world of in which women kind of you know, the old kind of great kind of German line about, you know, family, church, and children? Is that really where, you know, which the Nat Cons want? You know, is it really about kind of keeping foreigners out and kind of inciting hatred of people who are kind of not British, and getting into kind of close to kind of wanting to kind of say that there's kind of there's something particular and special about kind of the bloodline of being a Brit? I'm not sure that British think like that, actually. So I am hopeful that these foundations that have been laid in our country over decades and centuries. I mean, I discovered John Locke's essay on toleration in working on the book, which I'd never read. And here's this chap, it's 1689, he's a kind of leaning right philosopher, but and there's been religious wars the previous 250 years. And he says, look, come on, it's time to tolerate people who are Catholics. They will find their own way to their faith and respect their right to do it. And the foundations of a good social order is in which everyone finds their own way to their faith, and we tolerate them while they do it. And it had a huge impact, you know. And I don't think, you know, I just think that's where the Brits are. It's very deep in our culture. It's very deep in Shakespeare, very deep in Jane Austen, very deep in Dickens. You know, it's not kind of, you know, this kind of attempt to kind of make us kind of Midwestern rednecks. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to work. So that's my hope. I may be wrong. That's my hope.
Great, great. So I think we've already got someone with a microphone, so that's great. So anyone else put their hands up as well. So if you can say who you are, we may take 2 or 3 together.
Dennis Van Mechelen, RSA. I was just wondering, you've obviously made a lot of things mistakes were made in the past. Just wondering if you could elaborate, you probably have in the book, on the mistakes of the Blair-Brown government.
Yeah, I've got lots of that. I've got lots of that.
There is lots on that.
What more should they have done? Did an unethical foreign policy intervene in some respects as well?
I've got lots on them, yeah, don't worry.
Yeah.
Banking regulation.
All of that, you've got it, yeah. I'll give you
Yeah,
an answer, yeah.
Just like to elaborate on that.
Okay,
Great.
And what makes you think it would be any different second time round?
yeah, okay, good question.
Yeah, very good. And I can vouch for the book being very involved in that. And then if we've got another microphone, there's one at the back there. Yeah, you go. Yeah.
I really think that you do need to address the electoral system. Because in 1951, like you mentioned, where Labour won, the Conservatives took power, they did actually basically accept most of the things the Abbey government did. I can't see that happening now if you had a reformist Labour government and the Tories then came back in, them accepting that, in the state of the Conservatives at the moment. But the trouble with proportional representation is there's so many different systems. I would think that people should actually consider the second ballot system, where you have an election and any MP that doesn't get 50% will then have a runoff with a second person in that constituency. And that would then give people a chance to vote, if you like, with their heart the first time and then with their head knowing what the reality is. But it'd also give a time for, if you like, the progressive liberals and the ethical socialists to work together.
Yeah.
And I think it's simple. Or you just keep the same number of constituencies. So I just wonder what you think about that.
Great. Let's
Another
try
good
and take one more. There was a
Those are risky
lady,
things.
I think, here. Yes. Sorry, I don't know where all the microphones are. Oh, we've only got one microphone, maybe. Yes. It's down the front. I did see you first. It's coming. It's just behind you.
Thank you very much. I've set up a group.
Can you get your mic slightly closer to your mouth? Sorry. Great.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
This is very down to earth and practical and specific about the Erasmus Plus program.
Yeah.
Because when it happened, I set up a group of Erasmus professionals who were very angry that it went. And I learned a lot about it, that a good, more than half now goes to non-university students. It goes to the sort of training that we lack. And there's also evidence that Erasmus students of any sort, get better jobs and are less unemployed. How can we make business come in on the act and be less cowardly and say what they feel? Because you talk to businessmen, they say, Erasmus Plus students, we like them, we employ them, they're more independent, they're great.
Right.
But how can you get business to speak up?
Yeah,
Very
well,
good.
that's a- yeah.
Very good. Yep.
Okay,
Well-
three good questions. I was thinking, writing a book is fine. You give a presentation, then you get questions from the audience, which you wished you'd thought of that when you write the book. But however, I did think about the Blair-Brown years, and of course, look, I mean, I can I could start now and go on for another half an hour. I mean, in essence, Tony having kind of done that clause 4, then, as he says himself, he and Gordon respected the Thatcherite settlement, essentially, and wanted to use the growth dividend, which they hoped would happen, to finance better public services. In its way, I mean, when Ramsay MacDonald and Philip Snowden came to power in 1929, they wanted to make laissez-faire work. The settlement they inherited, the gold standard work, and they would use the growth dividend to support the interests of the working class. There is this strand in Labourism which doesn't want to challenge the status quo too much because you don't want to frighten the middle class electorate. And actually, but as things gathered pace, they did do. I mean, the bad things they did. Where I begin, they should have been much tougher on corporate governance. The Companies Act of 2006 is a small disgrace. Should have gone much further. It was absolutely obvious that leverage in the financial system had gone from 20 to 1 to 50 to 1 in 7 years, and it was obviously unsustainable. obviously unsustainable, and I was one of the people in 2006, 2007 that tried to raise the alarm about it, writing stuff in the Observer, and not the, might as well save my breath, actually. So that was a huge mistake. I think it was a great mistake, as David Miliband now recognizes, to have done what we did in Iraq. When I published my second book, actually, called The World We're In, I had a kind of private session with Tony Blair for an hour, which I went down on my knees in January 2002 when the book was published, saying, for Christ's sake, don't join with George W. Bush and invade Iraq. It'll be the mistake of your life. But, so kind of, so on the other hand, I mean, give me New Labour and what they achieved in 1997, 2010, over what happened subsequently every day of the week. When you look back on them, how good were they, and how terrible their successes were. So, you have to kind of temper someone's criticism of the New Labour with actually recognition that it's not easy to govern well, and they got quite a lot right. I think Sure Start they got right. They should have stopped the Council House sales programme. But look, I've already talked too much about it, but you can see that there's 10 pages on this, and more than that, I think, enough. Take a glance, you'll see that I tried to kind of address the issues. On this question of PR, look, I did worry when I wrote the book, or I was going down, into thickets of kind of detail that people wouldn't be bothered with. And I did wonder about doing a kind of, because there's a very interesting issue of designing voting systems that actually represent intensity of preferences and the complexity of preferences, and kind of, as you say, allow you to vote with your heart and then vote rationally. And, but my message to you is don't let the best be enemy of the good. And I do think there's been too much of that in progressive thinking in Britain. Let's cohere about something which is good, which is probably some variant of kind of STV, and kind of maybe pilot kind of intensity of preference kind of voting systems of the type you. But we've regressed. I mean, on May the 2nd, we're going to have a first past the post system in London for the mayor. Unbelievable, really. I mean, quietly done, alongside, kind of having to show your voter ID. I mean, there's some pretty basic things to get right first, actually. So that, I mean, I'm basically in the same place as you, but with my caveat about don't let the best be enemy of the good. How to get business to speak up? Look, it's perennially difficult. I mean, why didn't they speak up for the European Union, let alone the Erasmus programme and its benefits? I mean, one of my hopes is that, and I think it's quite clever of the Labour Party, and this defence and security pact with the European Union they want to strike in the first 6 months of being elected is big and baggy. It's going to be cyber security, data, energy, food, defence procurement, a lot of stuff in there, 10 to 15% of GDP. And I think if they get it, and in all those areas, there'll have to be conformity with kind of, and harmonisation with single market rules to make it work. And then you're going to have, renegotiating the Trade and Cooperation Pact, where there's going to have to look after financial services and creative industries because they've been hammered by the current system. And you're going to start getting, well, hold on a minute, I'm a food and drink manufacturer, how about me? You're going to start speaking up because they will see kind of that some parts of the business community are being advantaged and they're not getting the same deal. And sometimes I've begun to think that we have to divide and rule a bit with British business. Let's kind of they need to be bolder. They need to find kind of ways. We need to find ways in which they can speak for things that are in the common interest. And I think, one of the things I'd like to do is I'd like to require, for example, every single utility to incorporate as a public benefit company in which they have a social obligation and they have a new asset class on the stock exchange of purposeful companies, purposeful utilities whose sole job is to promote benefit from which they derive profit. And actually they will have to speak to kind of these social issues and education issues that you speak of, because that's how they achieve their purpose. So, Again, let's be brave. I think we have to change the rules of the game to get the results you want.
Awesome. Yeah, great question. So we've got one final round, and I think, is the microphone at this end? So we should go that way. There, there, and there, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Thank you very much for the talk. Inheritance tax polls it as the most unpopular form of tax. And if you reform council tax, you suddenly find people who looked out for a apartment in Islington in 1985 are now retired and landed with bills of extra tens of thousands. How do you find the political license for taxing wealth?
Great. And right over that way first. Oh, no, maybe there. Yeah.
Thank you. Gavin Barlow, KCL postgrad. The geopolitical situation we're facing at the moment isn't good. And I wondered how you felt that was going to impact on the policies and the priorities and the programme of a progressive government. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And
Very
then
good question.
right behind you in the corner. That's
probably our last.
So I was in the cheap seats. Thanks very much for your talk and your passion. I mean, if I kind of channel my inner Daily Mail for a moment.
We all have an inner Daily Mail.
I don't think you were inviting us to do. I mean, I'd just like you to comment more about on the crowding in example, I guess.
I'm sorry, Andy?
On the crowding in case, rather than the Bacon and Eltis crowding out argument. And I suppose if we look at, HS2, which I think originally was around 37 billion, I think we're now over 100 billion. We look at the reduction in productivity in the NHS, the last week's public attitudes have fallen to the worst ever. We look at the record of procurement in government. I suppose my question is, in what way do we crowd in, and how do we convince people that that money is going to be used effectively?
awesome.
So crowding in, the geopolitical position and taxing wealth.
Yes, small issues.
Small issues to be dealt with in the next 5 minutes before we have a glass of wine.
Yeah.
On taxing wealth, that's the reason I gave that Francis Bacon quote, is because I do think the right have been incredibly successful in labelling inheritance tax as a death tax. I think we just, a common sense called, wealth is like muck, best be spread around. Kind of people immediately get it. And actually, we haven't been we haven't crafted our responses to these kind of assertions about wealth. And I think, I think some of the there are more underground private cinemas in kind of Mayfair and Notting Hill, than the rest of Europe. Farnborough Airport is the private busiest airport in Europe. And I do think that the way in which GB News is funded by Paul Marshall is offensive, actually. I noticed they've had to have 40 job losses recently, paying kind of Jacob Rees-Mogg £250,000 to interview Lee Anderson, being paid £100,000 a year about how intolerable the Rwanda bill is because we need to leave the European Court of Human Rights. What? And again, I come back to something I said earlier. I think these is offensive, actually, this wealth. Increasingly, it's hard to public footpaths in the country. We get kind of, you find yourself walking down very narrow corridors because they've been fenced off by the very rich private landowner. You can't enjoy our own landscape and our own countryside because of the way in which the very wealthy are kind of hardwiring it to keep us out. It doesn't take much. All it takes is a talented politician or politicians to kind of lead a public debate. No one is saying and I'm certainly not saying in my fusion of ethical socialism and progressive liberalism and wanting ladders up, I'm not talking about kind of preventing people from becoming wealthy, but I am saying there's some proportionality required and some obligation to pay into the common weal. And actually trying to escape those obligations has made the rest of us kind of puts a greater burden on the rest of us or makes our public services more indifferent. You too need quality public services. So, you know, I do think that you say how, you know, it's because you've never heard anybody do it that you think it's impossible to do. But it could be done. And I'm not talking about even a wealth tax. I mean, and you can refashion council tax in such a way that actually most people in the country are either neutral or better off as a result of it. And it's kind of, it's where house prices are more than £1 million, where you might have to find kind of more money for council tax than you do at the minute. So look, I mean, you know, I recognise the difficulty. I also think, you know, a lot of this is about generational. I mean, I'm a baby boomer. You know, I'm north of 70, and you know, my wife died, and I found myself, you know, wealthy for doing absolutely nothing except owning, you know, one house, owning another house, and house prices going up. I mean, goodness me. I mean, you know, and of course I should pay more tax on it, and of course when I leave it to my kids or others, they should pay more inheritance tax. It's just obvious to me. You know, I didn't do anything for this money, and most people there's a number of us in the room I notice who are kind of in not dissimilar position to me. You're probably sitting on, you're living in, you know, some agreeable house and some in, you know, zone 3 or zone 4, you know, which is worth quite a lot of money. And actually, I mean, shouldn't you pay more? Or when you pass it on to your descendants, so that why wouldn't there be a kind of a reasonable? Why wouldn't society take a bigger cut? I mean, the idea that actually one should pass assets untaxed from one generation to another is totally barbarous. You know, what didn't happen in Imperial Rome, it didn't happen in ancient Egypt, it didn't happen in feudal Europe. I mean, if you were a baron and you wanted your son to take over the kind of castle after you had to pay seigniorage to the king of 15%. You couldn't avoid it. There it was. It was your obligation to the society of which you were part. It's only now, in 2024, that politicians, largely from the right, have the temerity to say it's a disgrace. You don't want to create great dynasties over time of the type that we're creating in Britain. That will kind of, it's improper and wrong. You know, use this language and we'll start to move the debate. I think, I may be wrong, but let's give it a shot. On the geopolitical position, I think the geopolitical position has opened up the possibility of an uncontested, or largely uncontested, defence and security pact with the European Union. I don't think that voters in so-called red wall seats, as they were called, are going to object to the notion that we in Europe have got to do more to look after our own defence, because we can't witness events in Washington. We can't rely on the United States using its extraordinary arsenal to carry on protecting us. And actually, if you don't want Russian attacks in the Balkan republics, and maybe, for Christ's sake, you know, in a worst-case scenario, you know, gazing us across the kind of the Straits of Dover, you know, we've got to work with our fellow Europeans who have the same interests as we have. And Jacob Rees-Mogg and Lee Anderson and Nigel Farage, you know, can be portrayed in the same way, actually, as actually the kind of the Democrats and mainstream Republicans were portraying very right-wing Republicans in that vote on Saturday night. You know, who are you, a Churchill or a Chamberlain? You know, are you going to take a Churchillian stance and actually work with our fellow Europeans to contest this menace? Or are you going to kind of, you know, effectively appease? Because that's the call. So the geopolitics opens up a different kind of politics for strategic alliances, and it's obvious that actually, I don't know big people, I mean, Modi's India, President Xi's China, and actually an increasingly isolationist America are not Britain's natural friends, actually. I don't know if anyone spending time in India recently, but I mean, they're not actually kind of rushing to pat Britain on the back. They want a very asymmetric trade deal with their former imperial master. we've got to stand with the countries with the same interests in the same part of the world as we are in. So I think the geopolitics has opened up possibilities. I think if the geopolitics were as they are now in 2016, I think the referendum would have been won by the Remainers. So don't be, on the other hand, it's bloody dangerous. I mean, the world is very dangerous. But that only makes the case for making sure you have your allies, know who your allies are. And I agree, actually. I mean, I think that there should be a kind of, the big nation states of Europe will want to have their own army, navy, and air force, but they don't have to have, they want the best weaponry at their disposal, and it isn't necessarily made by their own people. I mean, the Germans make very good tanks and missiles, thank you very much. I think I'll use those to defend myself with, you could create a European defense establishment as good as the American defense establishment to supply interchangeable arms to our armies to defend ourselves. And that opens up the way for more European collaboration. On the crowding in and crowding out, which is the last question, I'm not entirely kind of, are you saying that it's in, I mean, you're saying kind of a number of things in the question, weren't you? You're saying no one believes in public money or public agency because all the money gets wasted. How are you going to persuade them that's going to work? Look at these kind of white elephants like HS2, what a debacle that is. Back in your kind of hutch, Mr. Hutton. This is, Bacon Eltis might not have been kind of right, but more right than you. That's kind of how I heard your provocation. Perhaps I'm being unfair. Look, I mean, first of all, I mean, I think that, I don't know how, again, working on the book has been kind of eye-opening for me. I bet no one here has come across the kind of anguished debates in kind of 1915, 1916 about where are we going to have war socialism to increase production to win this damn war. And Lloyd George took that and he ran with it and he created war socialism, and production in Britain outstripped that in Germany. And actually we won the First World War. Same story in the Second World War. People don't, Churchill's greatness was that he had, of course, been a new liberal he joined the Liberal Party in 1903 and stayed in it until 1924. And he voted for the People's Budget, actually, in Lloyd George's People's Budget. And one of the reasons that the Labour Party were keen to have him as a war leader was they kind of recognised he was an old imperialist and all the rest of it, but he did have that strand to his personality. But here's what he did. He relied on Greenwood and Attlee in the five-man inner war cabinet to not have an armistice with Hitler in June 1940. He wanted war production to really get clever because we'd left almost everything in Belgium and France as a consequence of Dunkirk. So he insists that Ernest Bevin is brought into the House of Commons to kind of organise, run the Ministry of Supply, and with Greenwood and Attlee to make sure that war production really went for it, and we didn't have trade union problems and all the rest of it. And when Bevin arrives in the House of Commons, Churchill welcomes him in, and sits with Bevin on one side and Attlee on the other, because these were the two men he was looking to organise a war socialism that would win us the war. And by God, did it work. I mean, if you look at the production of every single kind of aspect, whether it was bombers, fighter aircraft, submarines, destroyers, our production outstripped the Germans. Outstripped the Germans. Ours went up by 3 times, theirs went up by twice. And we did better than the Americans. Actually, no one could hear that story. And actually, again in COVID, look how well the National Health Service did in actually kind of getting that COVID, getting the vaccines, rolling it out. The British state, when it chooses to, is bloody effective. And the Bacon Eltis stuff is was of its time kind of tosh to feed the kind of right-wing revolution that was going on at that time. There's absolutely no reason why. And again, I mean, I'm not a fan of Dominic Cummings particularly, but I thought he was right to say that actually we can do innovation in Britain, rather like the Americans have their kind of DARPA, their defense establishment. I talk about this in the book, actually. But I mean, if you want to get kind of innovation, what the Americans do is actually, throw big money at it. If something doesn't work, you kill it. But you back the stuff that works, and they're very aggressive on it. And that's what Cummings wanted to do with our innovation capacity in the UK. I thought he was right. He was actually recognizing that actually when the British turn their hands to it, they can get these things right. So I want to push back on a council of despair that says the British state can't be agile, the British state never does anything well, the British state is always useless, public money is always wasted. No, absolutely no. There's lots of examples in our history where we've done bloody well, actually, and we can do bloody well again. And indeed, the times require it that we do. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No, brilliant barnstorming ending. Thank you, Stephen, for setting that up as a response. So just two really quick announcements from me before we get to thanks. First of all, we got a couple of upcoming events, another one with a great partners, Fairness Foundation's How Workers Can Reclaim the Work Ethic with Elizabeth Anderson, the political philosopher from University of Michigan. That's an online event.
Oh, she's very good.
She is very, very good. On 25th of April. And then we've got an in-person event with Shami Chakrabarti on her book, Human Rights, The Case for the Defence, on Monday the 13th of May. Second announcement is you've got to buy the book, which is available at the back, and I'm sure Will be there shortly. Sign copies. Yeah, we'll get you a pen, don't worry.
I've got a pen.
Very good. So final things from me is just to thank the team for organising from the Policy Institute. Thank you very much to Fairness Foundation for the great partnership on this series, and Will Snell. Thank you to all of you for coming. Best wishes to Baroness Helena Kennedy for this evening. But finally, thanks to Will for his great book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Really good stuff.
Excellent.
Well, I did
really.